Imagine if you live peacefully in a normal world working as a packer, but then you discover you have an incredible tolerance for drugs. Each drug you consume has different side effects on your body, enhancing your physical and mental attributes among others. Suddenly, while walking through the city, a giant portal appears releasing demons. Thanks to the drug effects you manage to escape and even defeat a boss. But not everything is smooth or drug-fueled. A new enemy will emerge. What kind of substances will they use to save themselves next? This story begins with a man telling everyone to pack everything, and soon after it will go straight to their homes. Meanwhile, someone seems to be drinking something, giving everyone a good task, mentioning that he was already leaving. The man asks if he didn't want to have dinner with them, but the young man replies that he has things to do the next day. Then the other guy says he just wanted to know what Yule ate, since he was the only one who didn't seem tired after work. The truth was that the young man always took vitamins early, wondering if it was possible to gain so much power from them. Meanwhile, the boy was thinking that vitamins have the best value when one is tired. The young man's name is Park Hanyul, and he is 22 years old, and he got the best effects by getting high with the drugs he used. That's how he discovered his special attribute during his military service after eating the supplements his companion had given him. Even after a day of training, his fatigue went away with just 2 vitamins in a day, and the omnivore cleared his mind, increasing his concentration. Some time later, the young man seems to be getting off a bus, thinking that he should buy a coffee at the convenience store on his way back. Looking to the side, he suddenly notices something. Then a girl appears staring at him with a certain desperation, saying that this was the first time she was going to tell this to someone. And the protagonist in his thoughts assumes that the girl is confessing to him. Happy, the young man asks how he can help her. However, it wasn't what the boy was expecting, as the girl was just trying to deceive him, inviting him to a cult. As she walked away, the girl said she wasn't a bad person and that her name was Hanyul. Starting to run, the boy wishes her a good day, thinking that there were still people like that, and that he was completely tired of cults and saints because of his own father. His father used to be a very stable person. However, one day he ended up saying that he had made a very important decision, deciding that he would make medicines to become a saint. After his father said those shocking words, he quit his job and moved to his parents' house in the countryside, and he consumed a mix of medications and other ingredients, but he was taken to the hospital countless times after having a stomach ache. Then one day he went into nature because nothing was working, leaving a ride saying he would return with energy. However, that happened 20 years ago. That was when Park Hanyul was only 2 years old. While buying more vitamins, he thinks that it was a long time ago, and his mother went through hardships since his father had disappeared so long ago. Moreover, his father could have taken supplements like him instead of weird medications. As he leaves the store, he suddenly notices something strange, and a gigantic circle appears in the middle of the sky. Everyone around had no idea what it was. The protagonist on his part thinks that when he entered he didn't see anything like that. But he didn't think it was some kind of art, assuming it could be a type of spaceship. At that moment, the ground begins to tremble. Several people around start panicking, and Park calmly observes the situation. As the ground splits, a hand starts to emerge from the crack, and a horrifying monster begins to rise. Standing before the protagonist, it seems to be a type of demon. At that moment, it starts advancing towards the boy. Desperate, he thinks he has to get out of that place. Then his heart seems to start beating faster, and a message warns that it will begin using the nutrients. The demon about to attack the boy hears that message, which again warns that energy has been provided. Thus his senses and reflexes were enhanced. Then in a matter of seconds, the boy manages to dodge the attack, feeling confused because that blow was very slow. Amidst the situation, he wonders what had happened, questioning whether by chance he had monstrous power like that all along, assuming that it could be because of those supplements. So for that reason he could now flee easily. However, he notices that the other people around weren't as lucky, as they were being slaughtered by other demons, leaving Park irritated by what he was seeing. Starting to run, he thinks that in that state he had a good chance of winning the battle. Soon after, he kicks the monster, which ends up flying out of the ground. At the same moment both rush to grab the club, which successfully Park manages to grab, striking the demon on the head, thinking that it was much weaker than he had supposed. Soon after, several monsters charge at him. However, the protagonist defeats them one by one, and in a matter of seconds he is already surrounded by bodies on the ground, wondering what had happened. The boy then looks up, not believing what he was seeing. Because a giant demon was standing before him. Noticing his companions on the ground, Park thinks he should try to fight, because maybe the demon could also be weaker. But in a matter of seconds that monster was already attacking the young man. Then blood starts to gush. Meanwhile, several people were still fighting those demons. The man asks what would happen if the monsters went to that place, and the other says he's also scared, asking to close that door. At that moment someone is thrown into that place, hitting the two who were inside the store. In front of them a giant demon stood. Desperate, the young man begs not to be killed, begging for someone to save him. At that same moment someone seems to be smoking a cigarette, and the system announces that the elixir has been consumed. In a matter of seconds a protagonist charges at the demon, landing a kick on it, managing to throw the demon far away. And a very frantic pose of the protagonist appears. The system announces that adrenaline had surged in his body. Park in turn says they should start round 2. Charging at the demon again, landing a punch on its face. Then he delivers a sequence of punches. But at that moment the demon charges back. Even so, the protagonist manages to dodge, saying it seemed like he was still full of energy. Landing another punch on its face, telling it to taste that, smashing the demon's face into the asphalt. Successfully managing to defeat that demon, saying that it seemed like the cigarettes also had an effect on his body, and hoped his mother was okay. However, at that same moment the demon rises again. And as a consequence it grabs Park's head, punching it and throwing him to the ground. But just barely Park manages to hold its hand, delivering a punch to its stomach, which now finally and successfully knocks out the demon, mentioning that he was very tired and couldn't even move. However, he notices something else, as the other people weren't able to escape from those demons. Quickly trying to get up, he finds he has no energy left, wondering where those demons were coming from and why they were attacking normal people, begging them to stop. Soon after, a demon grabs a man, and the protagonist was just standing there watching the situation. Then the demon was about to finish off that poor man. However, a person was in the air. Grabbing a piece of paper, it seemed to cast a spell, managing to defeat several demons. Park's surprise realizes they managed to defeat all the demons at once, wondering who that man was and if he was really a person. Then the girl says the protagonist did very well, asking how he managed to kill a demon like that without any training, asking who he might be. Meanwhile, the protagonist watches without any reaction. The girl says she needs to see how much potential he has, asking him to extend his hand. However, Park was still confused by all of this. But the girl seems to cast a spell that pulls his hand, which she then begins to analyze, not believing what she was seeing before her, thinking that it wasn't celestial or earthly. But still it wasn't human, which could be explained as an irregular being. Although it's sad that this child was chosen, she couldn't allow someone to become a disaster that is left alive. Starting to use magic, she thinks she needed to get rid of him now. Then the boy thanks her for her help, saying that if she hadn't helped, something bad would have definitely happened. And for that reason he didn't know how to thank that woman. Observing what the boy had said, she falls silent, thinking that it was a pity that his manners and his pure energy were a waste. Throwing a pill into the boy's mouth, which as a result ends up swallowing. Realizing it was very bitter, he questions what the woman had given him. And at that moment the young man falls to the ground, and the woman replies that it was a medicine used to seal the center of his energy. Although it's not used to seal demons that can't be controlled, this was the only way to save his life. Because one day his irregular powers will ruin his life and the world around him. Even though the boy might suffer, it was for a greater good, asking the boy not to hate her. And if Fig allows, they will meet again. Soon after, that girl, without even saying her name, walks away, and the protagonist ends up falling to the ground, wondering what he had done for that woman to give him that medicine, and what she meant by that word irregular, and if it had anything to do with his special attribute. Getting up, he asks not to make him laugh. Because if he didn't have those powers, he would be on the ground with his skull cracked open. Quickly the young man goes to a store. Grabbing supplement, he starts drinking it, and the system announces that the drug has been consumed. Park thinks that from that day on he will use these powers to survive. Some time later the young man was already at home stocked with supplements, saying that hangover drinks also work on his body. Remembering that the girl that mentioned a disaster and that the medicine she had given him must have some effect on him. But for now, he will grab everything he needs and head straight to his mother. At that moment, his phone starts ringing and a message from the government appears saying that monsters were everywhere. And that message asks him to download the department's app to get more information about all that. About to download the app, the protagonist notices that the name was special. Precautions number 24. Assuming they just created it because the design was terrible. Grabbing his phone, you start scanning his ID and the app announces that authentication was complete. And that he would now be redirected to the app. At that moment several strange letters start appearing around the boy, not understanding anything. Park wonders what's happening. The system announces that they confirmed he had a spiritual physique. And for that reason, they would begin analyzing his body. Park thinks that it was similar to what the woman had said. And that it could be something related to the irregularity that might appear again. Soon after, the boy seems to feel some kind of pain, wondering why this had to happen now. Because the effects of that medicine were probably already kicking in. Then at that moment, the boy begins drinking his supplements again, thinking that now he felt much better. However, that message was still analyzing his physique. And soon after it announces that Park's analysis results had been concluded. There was a blue void material and its color represented trees. The chance of obtaining water from that material was extremely rare. And its name was bluish fuel. They called it that because it worked like a condensed elixir, held the energy of the entire Earth. Meanwhile, Park was still waiting for the system's response. The energy of the blue matter was an ingredient in the medicine the protagonist had taken. And since the effects of the hangover drink cured the poisonous effect of the medicine, only the energy of the blue matter had remained in his body. Thus something very interesting ended up happening to Park's body. The protagonist, desperate, realizes that his body was very hot. So he thought it would be better to wait for his fever to go down. However, the boy felt very restless, so wondering if there was some way to feel more comfortable. Then right after, he seems to have an idea, supposing that the best way would be meditating, mentioning that this wasn't one of the positions practiced by those people in martial arts movies. Besides, that position was very comfortable. So he will stay like that until his fever goes down. Park says he should have a regular physique, complaining about his mundane body. Then the system announces that the results show the protagonist had a mundane body full of tree energy. The boy thinks she gave him a medicine because he was considered irregular, wondering what that meant with the tree energies. Moreover, it seemed that the effects of the poison had disappeared, wondering if the effects of the ingredients change while he was being analyzed. Even so, it was a relief, as he could have been killed if the analysis showed he was irregular. However, a different colored system appears. And from it a man emerges, greeting all the citizens of Korea. Sagi wanted to mention that everything he was going to say from now on was completely true. 10,000 years ago the world was in much more spectacular place than it is now. Because those beings we call monsters roamed the earth, while other beings from other worlds crossed galaxies to reach Earth. At that time humans were killed and discarded. Amidst that chaos, a few chosen ones were granted spiritual physiques, a special power they didn't possess before. This acquired power gave humans a life expectancy comparable to that of monsters. Thus it signaled the beginning of a world where anyone could wield great powers. Then later these people were named monks. And in order to close the gates to heaven, they ended up sacrificing their lives for a greater good, making it so that humans could thrive on earth for eternity. These people were remembered as Myths and legends and their stories were passed down through generations. Thus they continued, protecting the gates as humanity progressed. Or at least that was how it went until a few hours ago. All the chosen monks will be patrolling their designated areas to protect the safety of all humanity. And also these people have been tested for their abilities, which gives them the right to enforce the law when necessary. Meanwhile, Park was still analyzing that system, wondering if this is what it meant by finding suitable skills for his aptitudes. At that moment, several other screens begin to appear in his vision, wondering if everything around him was skills. Realizing that it was indeed the case, because those are all the parts where he could feel the heat emanating. Additionally, in that image the protagonist was in the same position. After training systematically for a certain period of time, he could emanate heat from at least one of these 3 places. And once those 3 places start to heat up, you should begin the training of the ground path. Until yesterday he didn't believe in religion or anything like that. But now he was practicing the sacred breathing technique. Right after the boy seems to start meditating, surprised because it was much easier than he had thought. Assuming that even if he had a spiritual body, it takes time to feel the energy gathering in the 3 cores that could take months. Or even years for some, as it depended more on their talent. With enough training one can reach a state of emptiness and unconsciousness even of one's surroundings. Thus Park took his first step toward becoming a monk. When he opens his eyes he ends up confused because several plans were surrounding his body. Wondering what all that was and how long he had been in that position. Grabbing his phone he realizes that its battery had died. Therefore you should have a clock somewhere to check the time. However, when he looks he sees that it was June 22nd. Completely surprised because 100 days had passed while he was meditating. Sometime later the boy had already taken a shower, happy because there was still water. Assuming it was very strange as his injuries were healed and he didn't feel very hungry. Moreover, he hadn't lost much weight. Instead he had become much stronger. Grabbing his phone he notices it was charging, wondering if perhaps he should check the news. However, when he looked outside earlier there was a barrier in the shape of a giant dome. Wondering how there were holes with monsters coming out, and that area was probably an extreme danger zone. At that moment he realizes that another earthquake had occurred. However, it was just a horrifying figure walking across the field. Desperate, the protagonist wonders what that was, as there were several demons surrounding those buildings, thinking he needed to get out of that place immediately. However, he realizes that there was no signal in that place. So calling for emergency help was his only option. Thinking that he had put his temperature to sleep with the breathing technique and survived 100 days in the lotus position. Right after, a system appears welcoming Park, mentioning that he wasn't connected to a network and that some features require a connection. Looking at the system, the boy wonders if there was nothing in that place he could use. Additionally, the only thing that opened was his profile with his information. And also a strange thing called that had 2 available charm copies. The system announces that there were 3 usable charms, and depending on the user's nickname and ranking higher level, charms are given. And the first one was called Soft Steps, a special 9 franc magic. The boy thinks it was very easy, wondering if that was all he had to do. But still he didn't feel any change in his body. At that moment, when he tries to take just a small step, he ends up hitting his face against the wall, saying that the special magic contracted was indeed real. Wondering what the other abilities were. Then it is revealed that he had one of the abilities that would allow him to carry more weight, and the other was able to create a tornado of light. Park, surprised, wonders if perhaps he should use that on the roof. However, the problem was that the monsters could see the light and come after him. Moreover, he had copied the breathing technique last time, wondering if he should take a closer look. The system announces that the training is divided from 1 to 10 stars. And after the 5th star he could use nature techniques. Park in turn is surprised because He could also increase the levels. However, his hopes are dashed because it would take at least 10 years to raise a star. And for that reason he would need at least 70 years to use one of those. Nevertheless, the young man says he would check how many stars he had first. That was how he could assess himself by placing energy into both hands and checking the energy rings on his left hand. Thus he began channeling energy into his hands. The number of rings on his hand represented his star level. However, the boy seemed surprised by what he saw. At that very moment a monster began charging toward him. So he needed to find something quickly to help him. In a matter of seconds, a tiger was already at his door starting to attack the protagonist, tearing into his shoulder. In ancient China there was a skill called the absorption method, a skill capable of stealing the vitality of a beast. And the protagonist shows something similar to that ability. Then the boy incredibly ended up using a 6th level art, successfully defeating that beast. Meanwhile, the green aura began to surround the boy, saying that he only survived because he found a very useful ability. But at that same moment he collapsed to the ground. The system announced that a muscle had formed and his blood was stable. And the production of red blood cells had drastically increased. Then a green globe began to emanate from the protagonist's eye. Looking at his hand, Park wondered what was happening, why he could feel an enormous amount of energy flowing throughout his entire body, supposing that it was because his nutrients were replenished when he absorbed the energy from that monster. Even so, it was great, as this much should be enough to hold up after using the light tornado. Looking to the side, he noticed that some plants were sprouting from the monster's body, saying that definitely wasn't there before. And so he should pick them up as they might be useful. While walking he realized he could only use one sprout at a time. And if he had time to absorb the energy from monsters before finishing them, he could do something much better. However, he thought it was better to avoid too many problems, as he needed to hold on until the rescue team arrived. Observing the light tornado ability, he thought he would need to use it at some point. At that moment another monster appeared, charging toward the boy once again. As a result, he began using that ability again, landing a punch on that monster, thinking that there wasn't any time to relax, and he needed to get up quickly and call for rescue with his light tornado ability. But every time he kept encountering monsters like that, and countless times he simply started defeating them. But even so, it never ended and kept coming back. Sometime later the boy ended up reaching the rooftop of that building, completely surprised by what he was seeing, because a gigantic monster was standing next to him. Watching the situation, the boy thought he was going crazy. And at that moment another monster appeared behind him. But even so, Park thought it was all or nothing, charging toward that giant monster. Then he began using that light tornado ability. Sometime later a voice asked her. The protagonist was asking the boy to come out now. Noticing a man flying, Park sent his signal indicating that he was down below. The man in turn questioned why Park was just standing there and asked if he didn't have a talisman to fly. But the boy said he only had the 3 he had gotten earlier. The man, saying that was very boring, asked the boy to extend his hand, wondering what the boy was doing and if he couldn't hear. But the boy pointed out that there was a monster behind him. In a matter of seconds, the man seemed to use a talisman, effortlessly defeating that monster, telling him not to make him repeat himself and to extend his hand, asking who he was to be wandering around a restricted area and if he didn't value his life. Park about to explain what had happened. The man said it didn't matter because he didn't need to know that, so our boy thanked him for saving him. Leaving that barrier, Park thought it scared him because there were countless modifications from his mother, but he understood that as he had been trapped in that place for 100 days. And he was very happy that his mother and his relatives were fine, thinking that many things had happened during that time, wondering how different everything could be now. Sometime later the boy was in a building, telling his mother that he wanted to call her again, mentioning that it was nothing as he had been lost but had found his way back, and for that reason he would see her again in a few days. The other guy asked if he had finished his call. And the protagonist said yes, thinking he was relieved that his relatives and his mother seemed safe. Soon after, the man seemed to rush into the room, desperate, wondering if the protagonist was who he thought. Then the man introduced him, saying that he was one of the disciples under the command of the region unit. However, the man seemed uninterested in that, asking the other officer to leave the place, ordering him to do it and not to make him repeat himself again. Shortly after, the man asks if he had learned his sentence even before his heavenly gate opened. The protagonist replies that he had not. Then the man asks if he was worthy of waking his sleeping master. Park in turn coldly observed the situation. Then a system screen appeared in front of him, and the man asked if the boy could see it, asking if it said Ascendant and whether there were a total of 9 high ranks. Most of the awakened ones were disciples who could be called saints, and the mundane rank was the highest. However, that man had been recognized for his qualifications and ended up being qualified as an ascendant under his master. Age and ethnicity didn't matter, as the person who accumulated the most disciple training was the senior and not necessarily the younger one. That's why Park had to do it his best for his senior, as that was the unspoken rule. Park asks if ascendant was the lowest rank, and what rank his master was, irritating the man, who asked him not to speak of what he didn't know. He mentioned that Park had been born with a spiritual physique, so if he wanted to survive in that world, he had to stay under the protection of his superiors. For that reason, there wouldn't be a second chance, and if he said that again, he would die. However, Park says he had heard that no one could change masters 3 times, so the man might have been following that master because he thought his way of speaking was very interesting. This left the man completely furious with what he had heard. But at that moment a system screen appeared showing all the protagonist's information, saying that he thought the man had mentioned that rank was the closest one after ascendant. Standing up, Park says he needed to do his best for his superior. Sometime later, that man was arguing with his master, asking if he had treated his senior as he had been told, and if he was saying that he had handed over the technique he had used. Irritated, he says he was very foolish because he wanted to say he inherited the technique of a bandit, and lowered his head to that man. However, the man says that his performance range was greater than his own, which is why he was a high saint. His master says that it could be due to his body's condition, but the man says that if that were the case, he certainly could have an irregular physique. This leaves the man even more annoyed, questioning if he would keep saying such foolish things, and if he was implying that the boy was born with a mundane physique like the two of them. The man asks if that means his training is more accelerated. However, the master didn't even know that, because even originally it was difficult to see a human climb toward nature. Humans once came out of the water and then returned to the land. They mastered fire to fend off the cold and melted iron to refine it. Although there are great similarities between living things, their relationships are quite incompatible. The master says that the report to help her is likely because it was an extremely rare case. And if he understood, he shouldn't mention anything about the construction method, because they would deliver a drug to be careful with when his breathing stabilizes. Observing the situation, his master thinks it is very fascinating, thinking that the star wind only exists for those inclined toward nature, wondering how he had never heard of such a thing. Meanwhile, Park was at home working on his computer, thinking that according to the government's announcement, there wasn't a single person who had an irregular physique in all nations. The few people who had an irregular physique in spiritual and physical tests were isolated. However, our protagonist hadn't been caught yet. The irregular physique was spiritual and broadly divided into 3 types, which were the celestial, mundane, and human physiques. However, the 4th was an unpredictable spiritual physique that could appear even in the past decade when saints disappeared. The monsters still tried to interfere in the world. Therefore, to prevent them from doing harm, the saints united and banished them from that place. For that reason, their existence was nothing more than legends and tales. Furthermore, there were 2 examples of because it didn't make sense to think that he should be banished, as he wasn't a famous serial Killer. While drinking his coffee, the system informs him that the drug was consumed, saying that even in that bag of brown rice tea it's worth trembling when you see someone obtaining its maximum effectiveness. And he thought he had gotten a mundane physique result in the spiritual physical test. And because of that the blue matter from Brazil was given to him. While he didn't know how long the drug would last, he was trying to find something with similar effects, but there was nothing reliable. For that reason he thought there might be a limit to the information that could be spread to the private sector. But at that moment the boy seems to have an idea. He searches the word drugs in his search bar, finding some information similar to what he was looking for. Observing the seeds, he wonders what they were, wondering if those seeds were the ones he had seen before. While holding the seeds, Park Hanyul remembers that he had obtained them when he fought the beast and thought they were more common than he had initially believed. Upon researching online, he sees that there were no images about the germination of those seeds. Then he makes an anonymous post asking if anyone had seen those seeds before. Those seeds were purgatory herbs, a herb that grows naturally near the river Styx and if eaten raw would make a person sick. However, the conditions for germination were restrictive, making it extremely difficult to obtain germinated seeds. But the protagonist thinks that the ones he had were already germinated. So he decides to experiment with the ungerminated ones, deciding to use the solar wind breathing technique on the seeds, which in turn start growing the boy's hands. A man enters the room shouting. However, the young man was no longer there. The man wonders if he had escaped. He then searches the room to see if the protagonist had stolen anything. Opening the refrigerator, he discovers that the boy had taken one of his peaches elsewhere. Park continues experimenting with the seeds. Soon after, a small tree grows. Park Hanyul says that he had only breathed for 2 hours and it had already grown a lot, admiring his accomplishment, thinking that through breathing energy is exchanged with everything around him. As expected, the solar wind technique had the power to make plants grow. And if he continued cultivating herbs using that, he wouldn't have any problems living as an irregular. Then the boy consumes the sprout of the purgatory herb. While breathing, the young man thinks about how the heat was spreading similarly to the blue matter. However, the red aura disappears and the protagonist wonders if he had done something wrong, trying again. But the aura disappears as well. Park Hanyul says he thought it was working and wonders why part of it remained in his lower abdomen. He is confused, wondering if it was because the blue matter from the void was a higher quality drug. While chewing the sprout, he decides to try again. The red aura returns, but this time the heat was different. He then remembers what the internet posts said about yin energy. The purgatory herb had a yin nature while the blue matter from the void had a yang nature. Park Hanyul then wonders if this man he needed to learn an energy absorption technique for yin energy. But if he encountered mixed energies, his life could be in danger as before. In any case, he thinks that it's a relief because despite the low efficacy the power could increase. Then the young man uproots the small tree, but a noise ends up startling him. It's just a message on his phone. Upon reading the message, it says that the Majesty's son had died and warns everyone to be careful of the rain, asking all residents to evacuate immediately. People panic, wondering why they weren't warned sooner. Then a heavy rain begins and morams appear in the streets. People say it would be less dangerous if they didn't touch them. The protagonist notices that there was a protective barrier around the building and feels relieved for having followed those people there. Outside the building, someone screamed for help. A huge monstrous bird stands before a woman and the protagonist is shocked by what he's seeing. The bird uses its claws to lift the woman, throwing her into its nest full of worms. The monster then observes the people inside the barrier. A frightened man says that if he had been late it would have been him in that situation. Then Park Hanyul activates his abilities, thinking that letting a healthy person die made no sense. So he steps out of the barrier to face the creature. He lands a blow on the bird's head. It falls easily to the ground. The protagonist thinks that he didn't remember being that strong and wonders if it was because of the purgatory herbs he had consumed earlier. But he realizes that the intense rain was the tears of the Dragon King and the boy had consumed them. The water made the trees grow more and become stronger because it activates and amplifies his energy from the element of nature. Now the boy could do anything. Therefore he decides to use artifact refinement on his tree, which now became a demon slayer. Then the bird rises again furious and charges toward the young man. However, he defends himself, thinking that if he let his guard down, he would be pushed back and didn't have much time left before hitting the protective barrier. So he needed to hold on. Soon after, the creature opens a gap and the boy takes advantage and attacks the monster, realizing that the attack hadn't even scratched it. He wonders if it was because of the demon-slaying blade. The bird gets up again, its eyes fixed on the blade. However, it decides to attack the woman on the ground, but the boy saves her. The woman thanks him and he replies that it was still too early for her to feel relieved. The bird becomes enraged upon seeing them trying to escape. It strikes them. The woman manages to return inside the barrier. But Park Hanyul wasn't as lucky and crashed into a wall. However, the boy stands up relieved as he had no fractures thanks to the layers, although the effect had worn off. The monster flies to attack the protagonist again. He smiles, thinking that a bird that big flying was a total farce. Then he realizes he couldn't run to the shelter anymore because the drug's effect was wearing off and he was already weakening. He wonders if he should plant sprouts. However, it would be difficult to use that against the monster. But since it was a gamble with slim chances of victory, he could use his trump card. The demon-slaying blade has the characteristics of both a plant and a sword, growing its roots into the ground. It takes time to exchange energy and strengthen it enough. But while the dragon's tears were falling, it was possible to increase the sword's power by using a technique that absorbs the rain and stores the energy of the subdued demon. Now the boy's sword was charged with lightning. Then Park Hanyul charges toward the monster, landing a blow on the beast. Soon after, the monster's head gets stuck in a building. The protagonist takes the opportunity and cuts off its head. The people watching couldn't believe the boy had killed that thing. If someone had been killed by that bird, the authorities wouldn't have paid much attention. But that young man didn't hesitate to save someone in danger. They compared him to a superhero. People started recording videos of the boy. However, the protagonist is suddenly attacked. A man appears asking if he knew what he had just done. Because he had killed the bird that Miss Yue cherished, and burning someone like him wouldn't be enough punishment. The video of the protagonist being attacked begins to go viral and criticism starts to emerge. Owen asks if her child had died and if that man had burned the insolent one who killed her messenger. Her assistant responds that for now the boy had been detained. Yowu says it seemed like everyone despised her as they were only keeping that impertinent boy in custody. She becomes furious, ordering that all humans be told that if they didn't want to suffer her wrath they should set an example and kill the boy. But her assistant responds that there was a report indicating that the protagonist's actions had become a trending topic. Therefore the wounded should be kind to the boy, as there was a great level of dissatisfaction with the new leadership. Yowu says the rules of that world weren't fun and the government's rules were frightening. She was sure of remaining in some way to calm her down, and the maid in turn responds that she had prepared a tribute to ensure Ms. Yowu's reputation wouldn't be tarnished. Yowu then says she will wait for it. Soon after, the rain begins to stop and the woman says the Dragon King had relieved his sorrow. It was just an illusion that transcendent beings were free from desire. Ms. Yowu grabs a package and thinks that the important thing was that she managed to obtain it. It was a piece of trunk. That fruit is called the treasure of fantasy even by the gods. And its flowers only bloom once every 3,000 years. It's a mystical tree that only grows in the orchard of the Queen Mother of the West, the peaches of the tree of immortality. Yowu mentions that when the Queen Mother sacrificed herself to close the gates of heaven, the orchard disappeared, and if she could obtain a sprout from that bark, her name would replace that of the Queen Mother of the West. Park Hanyul is walking down the street remembering that a man had told him he had made all the deities look like bad people and that from now on he shouldn't do anything that made him stand out. Then the protagonist looks at his hand, thinking that even though his sword had been confiscated, he was happy to have obtained that. That night, the boy had found a block of wood in the bird's body and he wondered why that piece of wood had been stuck to the ankle of that monster. However, he realized that the trunk was alive. Soon after, that man appeared and the protagonist managed to get a sprout before being attacked. So he wondered if he should try to cultivate it. A year later a news report says that the government has taken various measures to purify the water. A man complains about the smell. He says the water problem is because of a monster and that the government should deal with it first. A month ago when the celestial energy was in disarray, a monster hid in the Han River. A 1,000-year-old snakehead fish. After crossing the world of monsters into a river in the human world, it became powerful enough to claim the title of God, calling itself the sovereign of the Han River. The creature declared that no one could use the river's waters until a human sacrifice was fulfilled. A boy watching a report says that fish seem to have a worm's brain. That was Yongaju, a disciple from one of the 8 sacred mountains on the Korean peninsula. Then someone tells the boy to avoid making unrelated comments during that meeting, and that it would be better to behave and sit properly. That was Shin Soman, the youngest disciple of one of the 8 sacred mountains on the Korean peninsula. However, the boy didn't care about that meeting because it wasn't a problem they could discuss and solve alone. And that in the first place everything was based on the immense will of the elders. The woman becomes irritated and asks if that's what his master taught him. She says 10,000 people have already contracted diseases because of the water, so they should find a solution as soon as possible. Then she asks how the boy dared to insult her master. Yongaju asks if the woman was capable of killing the sovereign of the Han River because 4 of the best immortal mystics tried to stop the creature but failed, and he questions if she wanted everyone to die at the hands of that fish. The difficulty in dealing with the sovereign of the Han River lies in its ability to use both earth and water techniques. Very few people have mastered 2 techniques like the sovereign. So the only way to defeat it is with an immortal who masters earth to force it away, or someone with a high rank in earth and water energy. The boy says he won't stop Yongaju from making his plans, but he won't participate. The woman becomes angry and breaks the presentation remote. Then the boy leaves to train. He says that if someone could defeat that fish they would have the solution. The woman walks into a forest carrying the demon-slaying sword because she remembered that a year ago a man killed Yu's bird with that weapon. And although he was imprisoned and eventually released, the sword was confiscated and kept by the Immortal Society. It was a rare wooden tool, and since it was shaped like a sword it brought much confusion to the heavens. But just as the energy that inhabited the weapon gradually disappeared, the confusion came to an end. Park Hanyul hadn't set foot outside Wanak in the past year. Sometimes he went out to eat with his mother or friends and watched movies in his free time. The girl remembers that he had said he wasn't using any phone apps, so he wouldn't be able to calculate his achievements. Considering what Park Hanyul had been through, it wouldn't be impossible. Then the protagonist appears, and upon seeing the girl he turns a corner. Yang Zaiju thinks she can't lose him and decides to follow him. However, she can't catch up with the boy even running a full speed with the help of a talisman. As a result, she loses track of him. But Park Hanyul reappears asking if she was affiliated with the Immortal Society and says he had no intention of running away, he was just surprised that the girl was following him. The girl notices that the protagonist was sweating and wonders why he only used physical strength and not a talisman to get rid of her. Then she throws a phone to him. The device has its user changed. After that, Park Hanyul shows his information. Yang Zaiju discovers that he was still a high immortal but ranked below her. Park asks if Yang wanted to use his wood element to kill the sovereign of the Ham River, wondering if the immortals really wanted that monster dead. That's how he saw things. Yang says no, because the reason her seniors hadn't taken action on that was that they wanted to see the juniors solve the problem without needing their help. The protagonist says that thousands of people were suffering because of it. Except in the offer, Park asks if by cooperating he would be compensated and if by any chance he could get his sword back. Yang asks how the boy knew about that. Park replies that by breathing he could interact with the trees around him, and that was the function of the technique he had learned. Yang thinks that's the reason Park could run so fast in the forest. Park then says he first wants to know if his curfew would be lifted as a reward. Yang replies that he was allowed to be rewarded, but attracting everyone's attention was a big problem, and besides there was no one to promise him anything just because he had helped. Yang explains that the curfew was initially imposed by the superiors to punish Park for killing Miss Yua's bird, but now that incident could easily be resolved if she did everything to persuade that man, helping them get rid of the sovereign of the Ham River. Some time later, Park was already by the riverbank and the other man asks why they needed to go to that place. He didn't know if Park had come to this place to try something, but it was the nuisance he had seen there because he wanted to see the creature. Yang asks him to calm down, as it was all because of the sovereign of the Ham River, wondering what the protagonist could do in that situation. Taking the album out of his backpack, he thinks it was disgusting. He had prepared it for this moment, but he hadn't expected to use it so soon. However, the wound warns the boy that it would be dangerous to get any closer, but she ends up surprised by what the boy was doing. Park asks if she hadn't seen this in elementary school, as he used to germinate plants in his class. That plant was very good for purifying water quality, and now it was halfway done with just the rest remaining. At that moment, a giant creature emerges from the lake. The protagonist grabs his sword and gets ready, saying he was about to start fishing for that fish. A thunderous roar echoes through the area. The creature declares that it was the god of that river. Therefore it wasn't someone who would be obedient to another. It attacks the protagonist, who barely manages to dodge. Soon after, he seems to start casting a spell hurling at the creature. Furious, it asks how he dared to do such a thing, but at the same moment it gets hit by several projectiles from the protagonist, leaving the monster even more enraged. Meanwhile, Yang is still protecting the other men, thinking it was impressive because by using the purifying plants, Park had completely drained all the dirty elements from the river's sovereign. However, if he continued at that pace, he simply wouldn't be able to win the battle. The monster says that despite his ability to deal with hard-to-see energy, his petty tricks simply didn't work, attacking the boy again, who as a consequence seems to start falling into the lake. However, he throws more of those seeds to support himself, mentioning that this was the last one he had. Throwing it at the monster, the creature says that it was the tree that was struck by lightning, asking if Park intended to destroy its body with that little toy. However, Park says that it was a toy he placed in her heart, asking if she couldn't feel it. And at that moment he starts diving again, staying they would see each other again. Beginning to cast a spell, he says it was a thunderbolt and lightning dart he made himself. Therefore he couldn't just let the creature leave. He starts electrocuting the entire area, successfully hitting the creature. And a huge explosion engulfs the area, successfully defeating the creature. The protagonist says that now the air was much fresher. Standing on top of the serpent, he says he had committed a bad act again, attracting attention once more, and didn't think it would end well this time. The reason the mortals had neglected the Han sovereign was really for the sake of trials and growth. So all of this was for their disciples and not for normal people. Looking around, it seems he found what he was looking for, thinking it was smaller than expected. The inner core of water-based creatures, the reinforced crystals, were rebuilt in the hope of becoming a dragon. For that reason he decides to take it as a reward for his mission. However, a man suddenly insults the protagonist, asking what he was doing. They quickly use magic to restrain him, asking if the boy knew what he had done. That man was the celestial king called Nikusha. The girl watching from above seems to recognize the man who was restraining the protagonist, remembering the words of that other man to just act like everything was fine until those ungrateful immortals found themselves in trouble and started complaining, thinking that the fact they had appeared like this and that the sovereign of the Han River had been subdued meant they had altered the fate of the Han River's death. The girl then greeted the man, saying she didn't know how the seniors had come to that place. And the man questioned whether it was worth saying that the place was safe or authorized, asking if she wasn't the disciple of Tebek, to which she quickly responded that he was correct. The man questioned whether she was saying that a disciple of such a master didn't recognize the gravity of the situation, because that boy she had brought a train for only 1 year without any master. Even though the wood construction technique is rare, a man who trained without a master for a year used a technique strong enough to defeat a sovereign, asking if she wasn't doubting that guy's identity and warning her that if she dared to open her mouth again it would bring great humiliation. To Tebek. Completely desperate, the girl seemed to understand the situation. The protagonist then began to laugh. The man asked if he had lost his fear, and Park asked why he would be desperate, wondering if he had done something wrong because they were doubting him just because he had a unique ability. But unfortunately this was the second time it happened. So if he was already checking the app, however, it was only 3 minutes after the fish had died that they all appeared. Everyone around seemed confused by what the boy had said. Park said they should have been watching that fish closely and judging by how they appeared right after its death, asking if they thought that if they had killed that fish it would be well regarded by the public. And since they ruined everything they could have used to grow, they came running to that place in desperation. The boy, now completely irritated, told them to stop. Soon after, an explosion happened, claiming that it was the protagonist who caused it. However, he ended up surprised because his attack had no effect. Park said he always aimed for the stomach just like before. And then he pointed a sword at the man, who became completely enraged, asking if Park knew what it meant to point a sword at him, and if he had any last words before he died. However, to Park it wasn't as if he would die, because the man wouldn't be able to kill him about to attack the protagonist. The man said that his arrogance reached the heavens, unleashing an attack on the protagonist. Then a massive explosion occurred, and the man seemed surprised because someone else had arrived to interrupt the fight, saying that the watchman should guard the garden, questioning what you wanted in that place. The name of that man was Bank, a high-level immortal from the 3 realms of heaven. Bak said he had a request for his lady. He hoped he hadn't interrupted their display of power. But this was just unjustified violence. And now, from what he saw, that boy was quite foolish. However, if they wanted to fight, he wouldn't stop them because both would have a bad reputation. But the boy had no justification. So please, they shouldn't get in the elder's way. And soon after, the two disappeared. Then the man asked why that lady had to call Elder Bank to save the protagonist. Sometime later, the young man seemed to be walking somewhere with Beck, asking if the young man knew he would appear, and if that was why he had been so bold, mentioning that you would give him some advice, saying that he might think he was special, but uncommon arrogance leads to ruin. Hearing what the man had said, the protagonist remained silent, saying that he would keep that in mind, thanking the elder for his advice. Thus 1.5 years had passed since that day, and he still remembered how confused he was with all the setbacks he had that day. No matter how good his intentions were, they weren't well received by everyone. Therefore, he had prepared carefully since the story of the Han River Sovereign began to unfold. For that reason, he wouldn't have to go through that again. And he wouldn't act without knowing things, nor would he be treated as a fool. He wouldn't be the victim as he was that time.